Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. There's a big change here, and I don't know what I'm doing, so we're going to start, and we'll just try to do the best we can. And I'll just ask if you'll be patient and with any glitches that arrive, and we'll work them out. So we're going to have the same kind of thing that I would do in class. I'm just going to lecture. The starting point here is a little confusing because of the two sections. I was at different places in the class. So I'm going to have to kind of go back and redo some of the things so that the people who were in the 8 o'clock class are a little bit ahead, but we'll catch up for the 9:35 class. And what I've been trying to get you to understand during this whole first 3 weeks or so of the class was that the American colonists of the British Empire had not only the most prosperous lifestyle of anybody in the world, but they probably also had more freedom than anybody in the world. The British Empire was run very loosely. The key phrase that I've given you was salutary neglect. England mostly left the American colonies alone, and they took advantage of that freedom to prosper. The American merchants exported American products to a large market, mainly in England, secondly to the West Indies, and third to other parts of Western Europe. But they did so rather extensively. By the time the 1760s came around, American merchants had found markets in many places. They sold American goods at a profit, and the American people benefited. And they had freedom. And the key to understanding this, that the textbook makes and that I've made, is that at that time, people in the British Empire, including those in America, defined freedom as owning land. If you owned your own land, you could take care of yourself. Most people in England did not own land. They had to work for somebody else. They depended on that other person. And if that other person, the landowner, decided he didn't need as many workers, he would evict you and you'd be joining the ranks of the homeless, and that was what's happening. But in America, a large number of people, not everybody, a large number of people, I usually give a number of 75% of adult white males owned land. And that meant they had liberty. They had freedom. In addition to that, Americans had substantial freedom of religion. We went through this a little bit before. We talked about the 3 colonies where religious freedom was the law of the land. Those were Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Most other colonies, although they were technically part of the Church of England, in reality the Church of England didn't function very well, and most people just did what they wanted on Sunday. Most of them didn't do anything. But if you wanted to have any religious belief, you could do it pretty much in the British colonies. That was not true in New England. The Puritans of New England still had pretty severe restrictions on religion, and they wouldn't allow people who didn't sort of agree with them to operate. But aside from that, Americans had substantial freedom of religion. And they had other basic rights as British subjects. British subjects had more freedom, more liberty than anybody else in the world at that time. A key to that was the idea of a trial by jury, other court rules that were part of the British law, the idea of innocent until proven guilty. That was well established for all British subjects, including those in North America. There were rules about inheritance, there were property rules. There were a lot of rules that applied to all British subjects, and Americans were British subjects. So they had all those rights. And in addition, they had self-government. The people of the British colonies were governed by their assemblies, and they elected their assemblies, or at least the white male landowners elected their assemblies. Very few people had that kind of local government. Very few people had control over their own government in the world. But in North America, in the 13 British colonies, people did. And they were very conscious of that, and they were very aware of it, and they were very defensive of it. They looked out for their assemblies, and they took pride in the fact that they had their assemblies, and that their assemblies governed them. So they felt like they govern themselves. They're not bound by any outside rulers or monarchs or anything like that. They run their own governments. So this is all, I've been trying to build up to this because it looks like Americans have everything going for them. And then the question is, why did they ever want to leave? Why would they want to get out of such a beneficial situation? Why would they want to become independent? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. And this is the big question of this whole period of American history. Why did the Americans want to leave this very beneficial system, this salutary neglect that they enjoyed so much and that benefited them so well? And the short answer to that question is England began to change the system. England started making changes that Americans felt were taking away the rights that they had worked so hard to get and that they were so proud of. Now, it's a complicated story, and it's going to take us a little while to get through it all. The start of this, and the reason why England, after centuries of neglect, or more than a century of neglect, why England finally decided to start changing things, the starting point for that was an event in 1763. 1763 becomes the turning point year in this period of American history. This is the change date. And what happened in 1763 was the signing of a treaty called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. It's a treaty between England and France that officially, legally concluded what historians refer to in the world context as the 7 Years' War, but sometimes in America it's known as the French and Indian War. This may surprise you, but the 7 Years' War lasted 7 years. Think of that. That's why American history is so interesting. We have these interesting names. The 7 Years' War. England and France had fought many, many wars in earlier years. And we could talk about those, but that kind of gets us off our topic. There had been 3 times from the 17th and 18th centuries that England and France had gone to war. And the reason for all 3 of those had to do with European politics, which is another subject in which I decided, let's just not get there. It just takes too much time, and it takes us away from our interest for this course in American history, because it really didn't have anything to do with America. England and France had all sorts of other stuff going on in Europe that had nothing to do with us. But we were British subjects, and there were French colonies in North America, what basically is now Canada. And because of that, Americans in Canada and Americans in the British colonies ended up fighting each other. And those wars weren't real serious battles. Americans didn't take them very seriously because it didn't have anything to do with them. They didn't identify very much with it. A couple of them were known in America as, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. It's the war of European monarchs. It's not our war. But we're British subjects, and we took it very seriously to be British subjects. We're very proud to be British subjects. We identified our rights, which were so important to us, with being British subjects. We looked upon our monarchs as the best monarchs in the world because they gave us so much freedom, and they were so much better than the stupid monarchs of other European countries, of France and Spain mainly, who had monarchs with absolute power. We did not. We have good monarchs, and we were very loyal subjects. So we'd fight for our king, or in one case it was a queen. We'd fight for our monarch. The militias, you know, the whole colonial defense revolved around militias. The militias would mobilize. Guys would put down their plows and go off and fight in the militia. And they would fight, and they would shoot guns at the French, and they would get shot at by the French, and some of them would get killed. And they would do the fighting, not real enthusiastically, because, as I said, they didn't really think of this as their war. And one of the worst things about it was that not only did people get killed, but the bad part was it cost money. The assemblies had to raise taxes to pay for the militias. Usually the militias cost almost nothing, but when they go to war, then it becomes serious. Then this is the real deal. And now you've got to raise taxes, you've got to pay money for the soldiers' supplies and ammunition and everything else. So the assemblies would have to raise taxes, which nobody liked. But we'd do it, and we'd go off and we'd fight the war. Yeah, as I say, not real enthusiastically, because we didn't think of it as our war. But the 7 Years' War was different. This war started because of something we've talked about in this class, the fur trade. The fur trade was enormously profitable. And for a lot of years, the fur trade had sort of been in the hands of the French. They were the people who were there involved in that early, and they had the ties with the Indians. The fur trade, as I told you, depends on Indians going out and doing the actual trapping. So the French had a long time lock on that trade, but it was so profitable that British subjects, these are people in America who were British subjects, decided, let's try to get into this too. And they'd go out and they'd try to get relationships with Indians. They'd pay Indians money to drop their ties with the French and join them. And there's a real serious competition between French fur traders and British fur traders. And it gets started a little bit later. The French for many years sort of had the control of it. And then the Brits, around the 1720s, 1730s, got more and more involved in it, and there's tension between British fur traders, French fur traders, and eventually the tension and the struggles for control of the trade, and a lot of it involves allegiances with Indians. It spilled into actual combat. So now the assemblies have to go out and really pay for their militias to do major fighting against French armies. The early years of the war, the first couple of years, went very poorly for the British subjects, who were the Americans. That's us. That's our people. After all, they're not really professional soldiers. The French did have professional soldiers. The French had troops, trained French troops who would come over. And we've got militias who are really not soldiers, they're farmers. And their reports of battles, they fought courageously. They were not going to just run and hide. And they took seriously their loyalty to their king. They were British subjects and they loved their king, as all British subjects did. And so they go off and fight for him. And they do their best. But, sometimes being a farmer took precedent over being a soldier. This soldier business is a sort of a sideline. That's something you do on weekends with your buddies. And yeah, you're going to fight now, but you got to keep track of that farm. And so a lot of times the militias go out and they'd be there for a while, and they'd fight for a while, but they'd say, oh, we're only going to do it for 6 months or whatever. And then when the 6 months were up, ding, they'd all go home. And that might be when they were in the middle of a battle. And all of a sudden they'd leave. And this was kind of frustrating for British officers who were trying to sort of be in charge of this whole thing. because they couldn't count on these militias to be there all the time. Some of the militias refused to leave their colony. They're not going to go off and fight in Canada. The militia of South Carolina, they're there to defend the people of South Carolina against whatever, hardly anything to be defended against. They're not going to go off and fight in Canada. So they wouldn't leave. I mean, that's the deal. They're the militia of South Carolina, and the same was true for several of the militias. And an especially frustrating thing was, for British officers, they couldn't get these militias to work as a unified army under unified control. They just wouldn't do it. Each assembly said, we control our militia, we make the rules, nobody tells the militia what to do except us. So this was kind of frustrating because, if you're going to fight, you need to have an army with a command structure, a strategy planning structure that works for the whole army. And we didn't have that. Now, I had mentioned in the 8 o'clock class that this is kind of ironic that this war started when it did. If you'd done the math, 7 years, it started in 1756. Just 2 years earlier, in 1754, a number of Americans had tried to set up some sort of a structure to tie the colonies together, to tie them into a single unit. A name that many of you know is Benjamin Franklin. He was sort of a leader of this effort, and it resulted in what was called the Albany Plan of Union. The Albany Plan of Union of 1754. The people from various colonies, with sort of the leadership from Franklin, met, as you can guess, in Albany, New York, and they drew up a plan which would have some sort of a super council or a super assembly to sort of override all of the 13 assemblies. It would only have limited authority. It wouldn't be able to tax by itself. It would rely on the 13 assemblies to do the taxing. But it would have some efforts to kind of oversee trade among the colonies. And it would have the opportunity to sort of have a supervisory body of some sort to oversee the various militias in event of war. And so this was drawn up, and it was submitted to all of the 13 assemblies, and they all turned it down unanimously and vigorously. They all absolutely refused to do anything, to have anything to do with it. And poor Ben Franklin went back to his home assembly in Pennsylvania, and his colleagues in the assembly, he was a well-respected leader of Pennsylvania, and his colleagues all said to him, Ben, what were you doing? Were you nuts? Each of these assemblies wants to protect its own power. They are very conscious that they are the assembly of their colony. They make the rules. Nobody tells them what to do. And so that was rejected and never came to anything. And there was no other kind of overseeing of the various militias. So they each did their own thing, and they said, we're run by our assembly. Nobody tells us what to do. So this was very frustrating for the British Army, and I'm going to have to take a break here because this only runs for 20 minutes, and we'll find out what are the British going to do.